Hello, thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone to our very first meeting for IIRSM Europe. It's great that so many of you could make it. I wanted to start just by saying what we're hoping for IIRSM Europe. So we sat as a committee and went through our objectives. Probably the biggest is networking. We're hoping to have a venue here where people can ask open questions and discuss the things that are most important to them. So a couple of things that we're going to do for that are face-to-face meetings. So Dave and Cole, who you're going to meet later, they're the people taking responsibility for this. I know they've got some great ideas for how we can have interesting venues that people would like to come to. I know because we're Europe, it involves a bit of more traveling. So if we have a really good venue and lineup of speakers, we hope to attract people to that. We also have a WhatsApp group, which was fantastic during COVID. So there were so many things that were new to all of us, and having an opportunity to discuss. I mean, often the information that's coming from governments is very generic, but we could really get down to the nitty-gritty about what do I do in this situation, and our networking through WhatsApp worked really well. So please do sign up to that. The second objective we had was about personal development. Now, we plan to run a series of webinars, probably monthly, and we have a couple already in the lineup. We're going to talk about behavioural safety and about transport. I know that we've all gone to a lot of webinars over the COVID period, but we hope that ours will be particularly interesting and relevant and targeted for what you're looking for. If you have some ideas of what you'd like to hear about, please do drop me a line, because it's really important that it's what everyone wants to hear. Of particular interest for the webinars is the system gives us CPD certificates. So those are also useful to people. And you'll be able to find a link in it to a discount code. So this is a discount code for 20% off the membership fees for IIRSM for joining our European branch. And we'd love you to take advantage of that and join us. So that's what we're hoping to achieve. If I just talk through what we're going to do today, we've got starting with Philip Pearson, who's the Chief Exec of IIRSM. He's going to give us an overview of risk management and how IIRSM fits within all the organisations that are available, so you can see how it's relevant to you. Then we're going to have a short meet the committee. So we're all sitting here ready to give our very short introductions, and hopefully after you've had your introduction, you'll get in touch with us and we can continue the conversation. Then we have the main event, which is Ruth Denyer. She's a co-president of IIRSM, and she's going to talk about a positive risk climate. And of course, we'll have an option to ask questions to her and to everyone on the call after that. So thank you very much for joining us again, and I'll hand over to Philip, please.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. I really firstly want to really kick this off by saying how delighted I am to be speaking to you all today to launch this European branch of the Institute. It joins 11 other non-UK branches across the world, and we also have around about 11 UK branches. These are all networks that, as members of IIRSM or even as non-members, you are able to join. They are advertised quite comprehensively on our website, and we're trying to do our utmost to really ensure that most branches meet on a very regular basis. They also, the webinar program that we're putting together has the branches input and the branches at mind as well, so that's the key thing for us. I'd like to also formally thank everybody that's got us to where we've got to over the last about 6 months or so, when we've been working to bring this group together. So I really, as I say, would like to thank Alison for standing up and being our initial chair, and I'm hopefully that in future we'll be able to meet face-to-face on a more regular basis as well. Certainly from a UK perspective, it'd be great to be able to meet you all at a face-to-face meeting at some stage. IIRSM has been going through a really, I suppose, a significant period of change over the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. We've recognised that I suppose a lot of our members have been working, traditionally in the pure health and safety sphere. They've started to take a much wider role in industry, but they've not necessarily had the skills or the opportunities to build on their health and safety skills to a wider business sense, I suppose. Our journey is really to focus on that wider risks position. You are all risk managers in whatever ways that you operate. We want to make sure that our members to their fullest extent are able to get the skills to ensure that they are more readily available to influence at board level, and that's really key. And that starts from the very beginning of our members' lives with IIRSM. In the past few years, we've developed a joint qualification with NIBOSH around risk management. It's a certificate level at the moment, and we've greenlit the development of a diploma level qualification with NIBOSH to really focus on allowing health and safety professionals to gain those skills in the wider business sense and the wider risk management sense. So it's really key that to help us get this message out to the wider world that IIRSM isn't purely about health and safety. It's about actually talking to industry and making sure that industry can come along with us on our journey. I've also want to make sure that as a group, the IIRSM is able to support all the networking, all the networks that we have across the globe. And it's very important that we have a central support for you. But ultimately, it's your professional body, it's your organisation, and it's really important to us that you lead on the discussions that you want to have that suit you in your region. And that's why we will provide you with the resources to support that activity. But really, it's very much your organisation, your professional body that we want you to be able to lead on. So we're reaching out to any members that are on this call, or anybody that you have a contact with, to get in touch with us and really put yourself forward, because we want to allow you to be able to develop your own skills as well. If you're not used to public speaking, if you're not used to actually networking in certain ways, we have an emerging risk leaders group, which we're hoping to provide a safe forum for the brightest of the brightest to come on board, to help develop their skills and to come and join us and go with us on our risk journey. So we also have a mentoring scheme, again, which we are looking at to develop almost like a reverse mentoring scheme. So those that are in relatively senior roles but aren't quite technologically savvy, we'd like to pair you with a relatively younger person that could actually give you some of those skills that you're not necessarily up to speed with, but also that you could then mentor in the opposite way as well. So there's lots of quirky things that we want to do together. We've invested quite heavily in our team, and I've got a new member of head of value that I'd like you to reach out to. She's currently put out a recent membership survey for us as well, for our members, and we really want to just listen to what you want from IIRSM, from the central team, but also from our wider membership as well, what benefits we can bring to you in the longer term. So really, I know Alison talked at the. I was going to talk about kind of like, you know, risk in its totality. I just wanted to really just get across to you that again, we've been a traditional health and safety body for over 40 years, but we are changing, and we're going on a really rapid journey of change as well. We'd like to bring as many of you with us. We'd like to learn from you as well, and understand what business really wants as well. But the key thing for us is that we do it in partnership with our members. I'm not here to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. That's very much for you to tell me what you need to help deliver membership growth, which is really key because it is a numbers game. We have plans to grow significantly over the next few years, and we will need our wider membership to help us do that. So really, that's all. That's the kind of like the introduction that I really wanted to give you all. I wanted to make you aware that the Institute has a competency framework that it developed over the last 2 years around risk, and that I encourage you to go on our website and have a look at and involve yourself. Have a look at and understand where we're coming from in terms of wider risk. Because the competency framework really is the core, the bedrock on which we've developed our qualification, our new routes to membership, because our routes to membership are wider than pure health and safety now. And also it shows you the direction of travel of this organisation, which we're hoping to create very much a clear blue water between us and any other professional body, so that we sit in a space that no other organisation is currently sitting. So there are plans. Ultimately, we're an educational charity. We're here to educate and inform and create networks that allow people to do that. This European branch is another piece in the jigsaw for allowing us to do that. And I welcome all your attendance, and I really welcome your support for those that have put their hat in the ring as volunteers to lead this European group at the moment. So much appreciated, and I'm more than happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Any questions for Philip? Or
not at the moment, no.
Okay, in that case, thank you very much for Philip. It's an interesting introduction. And now if the committee can come forward and unmute themselves, we're going to do meet the committee. There's Dave as well. Can you see Dave? Yes, okay. So as a committee, we've been together for maybe about 4 years now, running different events, and very much enjoying working together. So if we can just introduce ourselves to you, and then please do get in touch. I'm going to start with Dr. David Gold, who is the Vice Chair of the group.
Thank you, Alison.
Go for it.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Dave Gold. I'm a fellow with IIRSM, and I've had over 40 years of experience in risk management, particularly in the field of safety and health, 23 years of which I spent in the UN system. I was the Director of Training and Education for the International Labour Office, working globally. Specifically, my fields of expertise, although they're broader than this, as it's rapidly expanding, always expanding, is safety at sea, fire safety, diving safety, and psychosocial stresses at work, along with the generic sort of safety and health. I am physically located in Genolier in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. I work in different languages. And I spend part of my time also in the United States, doing a variety of different things. And I think there are endless possibilities. We've had some experience with Alison's guidance, working within the scope of Switzerland. But now that we're able to expand that scope to the rest of Europe and share the idea of an English-speaking entity and potentially other languages in the future, where we can work together and see how we can address some of the more traditional and some of the newer emerging risks that we're facing on a regular basis. So welcome all of you, and look forward to the possibility of working together. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, David. So John, would you like to go up next?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Alison. Thanks, Dave. John Pears, also a fellow with IIRSM. By education, a chemical engineer. I then moved very rapidly into HR, and I'm also a professional member of the CIPD in the UK. And then moving into operations and major projects, and finally into EHS, where I am now as the head of strategic initiatives for a company called Givaudan. We're a Swiss-based global company, primarily in flavors and fragrances, but also other products around flavor and active beauty. In terms of my background, although it's quite varied, one of the common factors has always been around people and the people aspects, and it's the people part of risk that really stands out for me. You know, particularly around things like perception of risk, attitudes to risk, tolerance of risk, and overall the risk culture in an organisation. In one of the, I think one of the key parts of my career was leading a project for a greenfield build in Hungary, and it was a new country to us, new factory, new workforce, everything was new. And as you can imagine, the risk assessment was rather long. And I always remember presenting this, and there's a lot of discomfort about that risk assessment. And then I went away and put together a mitigation plan, and suddenly everybody was comfortable with it. And I did point out we haven't actually done anything yet. We haven't carried out the mitigating actions, but somehow by naming it, people became more comfortable with it, and it got me really fascinated with risk. So we then had the conversation about tolerance for risk, and I was told we shouldn't talk about risk tolerance. And you realise the comms team comes into this and talks about, well, we can't talk about tolerance of risk because people think we might be taking risks that we shouldn't take, or we don't care about risk. But actually, by not talking about it, you create more risk automatically. So I'm, very much this believer that we need to have the right culture around this to be able to talk about these topics openly, really understand the risks, and make the right decisions about how much risk we're prepared to take. So it kind of got me thinking an awful lot about risk, and it's why I'm also very happy to be with IIRSM now, and that it's broader than just health and safety and environment. It's a wider range of risk topics, and I think there's a lot we can learn. So very happy to be in this group. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Cole?
Hi everybody, I'm Cole Mclaughlin. Over 15 years experience in the construction industry, and I'm working now for Jacobs in Switzerland, part of their major programs team in the health and safety team here. Yeah, I hope with the IIRSM group that we can, or that I get that opportunity to meet with people from other risk fields, other health and safety fields. That's what I hope for myself, and that's why I'm a part of this organization. Yeah, thank you.
Do you know what I like as well, Cole? You're out of all of us, you came looking authentic. So thank you. So I'm Alison Hind. I'm the chair of the group. My background is, I'm obviously from the UK. You can tell from my accent there. I've been a health, safety, environment, quality manager, consultant, auditor. I think most notably, I did a big project with the health and safety executive looking at employee engagement and really how to change how people think about risk from it's a big stick approach, it's something that I'm being told I have to do, to something they can actually see the benefit in doing. When I came to Switzerland 8 years ago, so I now live in Zug, which is halfway between Zurich and Lucerne. I had an opportunity to have a rethink about how to get that message across, and I started a software company called Proactively. I was really lucky to have a good team here, and the idea is that we're trying to get away from paperwork and bureaucracy and have a system that really works, so it's solid, and it gives people the information that they need. So it's a kind of a mobile app system to try and improve employee engagement whilst getting better control of risk management. So that's the basis of what I do at the moment. But I also spend quite a lot of time doing things like IIRSM, and I'm really happy to have this as a format where I can meet interesting people and really just to discuss, because it's very difficult to work in isolation, which is a problem that we often have as risk managers, unless we're in big organizations like John and Cole. So so thank you for giving me that opportunity, and I'm looking forward to meeting more people through this. Okay, so are there any questions for the committee at all? Julie is the person who's monitoring questions. I think, has everyone seen that there's a box that you write questions in? I don't know how. I did actually have trouble with, on my chat, that I can only chat with myself and the presenters. So I don't know if that's an issue as well.
No questions at the moment.
No questions. Okay. In that case, let's move on to the main event, because we're very lucky to have Ruth Denyer here to talk to us. She's going to talk about positive risk climate. And yeah, there she is. So hello, handing over to Ruth. Thank you very much for joining us.
No problem at all. Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. So the topic that I was set was positive risk climate. I thought a lot about it, and I thought that actually risk leadership kind of breeds that risk climate, and there was some learnings that I've had over the years that I thought would be useful to share and maybe spark some conversation as well. Just for those of you who don't know me or my background, I have been in safety for, I think it clocks up to 25 years now, and probably in 2015 I started to really get much more interested in safety as a broader risk subject, and operational risks and how safety plays a part of that, and the psychology about risk management and how big organizations manage risk. And I did a course at LSE, and I started looking at resilience, and kind of went personally embodied the journey that IIRSM is going on around safety, but actually moving this into this broader risk conversation. And I just think it's fascinating, and I think it's so interesting when we start to dig into it and understand it more. And like John mentioned, things like kind of that risk tolerance and how uncomfortable people sometimes are with talking about accepting a level of risk within activity. So that's a bit about me. The slides, I think Julie's going to click through them for me. We had a bit of problem with the slide share, so I'm going to have to do next slide, please. There we go. Amazing. So when I was thinking about risk leadership, I was thinking about what I've really learned and thought about over the past, say, 6 or 7 years in terms of how we talk about risk. And these relate to safety, but also risk across an organisation. And there are 4 things that really have stuck in my mind as very, very important when we're talking about risk leadership: ownership, language, trust, and curiosity. And they need to be built into every part of risk management. So be that your safety management system, how you report on risks, how the board talk about risk. These are really, really important things to think about. And I challenge myself to think about them from the everyday work we do as safety people sometimes through to how do we talk about risk at that really senior and executive level, and how do we engage with others on risk. So if I can have the next slide, please. The first topic is ownership. So this is kind of, excuse me, I'll just get a drink. I've tried to find a little quote that summarizes where I'm getting to with this. So about risk ownership, it's kind of who answers the question about, is the risk worth it? So what I became more aware of is, as a professional with deep expertise in a risk topic, sometimes we're asked to own the decision about a risk where we don't perhaps have the full risk context, if you like, because the risk we're taking is in support of a broader objective of a business. And so we need to be supporting that decision making, but really looking at the people who are best placed to make that decision in the round and helping them understand the upsides and the downsides of their decision. So be it a safety risk, where it might be that the downside is, the likelihood that someone's going to get seriously hurt or injured is very, very high. Or it might be a risk, an environmental risk, where there's an issue around exposure to a chemical or something like that. Or you could be talking about a data risk. All the risks are the same, they have upsides and downsides. And so it's being able to articulate not only the downside, but also think about the upside of that risk, because people are taking risk to achieve something. And we have to spend time understanding that to really get to actually who should own this, who should make this decision. Because if you take decision making away, people never understand the full context. So context for decision making. Expertise, so how that expertise feeds into decision making locally, and actually where as an expert in the organisation you're placed to support and help, and how do you have those conversations in an impactful way without maybe getting into too much of the kind of specialist language that we hold as topic experts. And then tolerance is interesting, and what one person might think is a tolerable risk might not be what somebody else thinks. The lights have just gone out in the room I'm in. Hold on a moment. Can you I'm just going to pause for 1 second and I will switch them back on again. The issues of being in the office again. I'm back online with the light on. So who decides on risk? So these are the questions I would charge you to ask yourself in what you're doing every day, and when you're thinking about risk, is think about, are the right people owning these risks, understanding the upsides and downsides, and making the decision? Is that happening, or is it being pushed to somebody else in the organisation to make a decision, maybe about the downside, but without understanding the whole business context? Is it a transparent decision-making process? If these risks impact people, do the people who they're impacting know what decisions are being made? And is the organisation clear about what risks are being made? And then there's a piece here at a more organisational level where you have to think about cumulative risk, and where maybe if you have dispersed ownership, how do you understand the overall risk taking of that organisation, and how do you kind of break that down, and how do you make sure you understand that as a whole picture as opposed to just a piece of the puzzle? And I think for me, this question has really led to some of the interesting work I've done around the ownership, and then those people you actually really actively need to engage with to understand the perspective that you're bringing to this, but also that what their responsibilities are and how we can help them in making good decisions. So that's ownership, really important part of it. I think when you're thinking about a risk climate as well, is making sure you're clear on who is making those decisions and who owns it. So that's the first one. The second one, next slide please, and I hope the lights literally stay on in the room, is around language. And the more I've worked in organisations, the more I've talked at very different levels, from the people who are actively undertaking work on, if you like, the shop floor through to the boardroom, the more I've become aware of the importance of language. And I know that sounds kind of a small part of what we do. We all write papers, we all do reports. Actually, it's so important. And that phrase, words create worlds, I think says so much, because when we're writing something down, we're not just writing down facts, we're creating a story that we are explaining to people the context of risk, building their understanding, but also by writing it in a relatable way, we can then explain our perspective so much better. And I know historically, 10, 15 years ago, I wrote stuff with much more perhaps technical jargon than I would do now. And I think a lot more about what I'm trying to say and what picture I'm trying to paint for people to really understand. The other thing that language helps with, kind of cross-domain alignment, which sounds very technical, but what I'm getting to here is, if you're talking about safety risk and you're talking about maybe data risk, if you use different languages to talk about the impact of the risk or the likelihood, then people can't think about them as risk-based concepts. They start to think about them very much in their own specialism. And I think part of the trick of this kind of risk culture and building it up is to agree a shared language, which is probably quite simple actually, around those kind of things, like what's the impact, what's a severe impact to people's safety, and what's a severe impact to our data security, and how do we talk about that in the way that everybody in the organisation can understand that's a really bad thing if that happens, and how do we align our terms on likelihood? Because I can guarantee you, if you start to dig into all the different people who do risk assessments in your organisation, you've probably got a lot of different scales being used. And wrestling that into one methodology that people start to understand really helps have that conversation and create the world around risk that is understandable for people who aren't deeply involved in a single risk. I think I put accessibility on this because if you use the right language, risk becomes an accessible topic. I think there's a lot of, I think you can block people out by making things much too complex. And that's not that we need to simplify things to a level that stops it being impactful. It's that we need to think about the audiences we're trying to engage with and make what we're saying relevant to them and actually not overcomplicate things where it's not necessary. And I know it is so easy to do, and it's so easy to use little bits of jargon that you've picked up along the way, and actually thinking about what they mean to the audience is really, really important. Language embeds ownership. If you use the right language when you're talking about risk that's relevant to owners, so things that they can really relate to, then they can own that risk. If you wrap it up in technical jargon or kind of, if you like a bit legalese, people don't tend to relate to it as much because they're not part of that world. It needs to make sense. Driving understanding of risks comes from all of this. This is all leading to this positive risk climate. And I really believe that if you get the language right, what you do is you empower innovation and creativity around how do we manage these risks? What are the right risks to accept? And actually, sometimes to the mitigations. So what's the best way to mitigate this risk? Given these constraints we've got or the guardrails we're working in, because we understand them, because of the words we talk about when we're talking about risk, how do we who own those risks mitigate them? How do we come up with a plan of how we operate given the constraints we're working within? And I think that's a really interesting place to be. And I think COVID taught us a lot about that in terms of actually, if you can explain the constraints to the people who understand the work and do the work every day, some of the most inspiring ideas and innovations come from those people who then understand what constraints they're working within and go, okay, how do we still get things done, but given the constraints we're working within? And I think that's really important because we don't have the answers always. We need to work with people to find them. So language is my second one. My third one, next slide, please, is trust. And for me, I think this has been a real focus of me. It's for me personally, I think it's very, very important. But equally, the more I've understood it, the more I believe this is going to be key to any risk climate, be it financial, safety, whatever it is. You look at all the challenges around risk that have happened, from issues in the city and trading through to big safety disasters that have happened. Trust comes at the center of a lot of this. I love this quote from Simon Sinek. So trust is built on telling the truth, not telling people what they want to hear. I definitely feel, as kind of people who are risk professionals, that's something we have to get comfortable with at different levels in the organization, because sometimes what people want you to do is tell them it's all okay. And actually, sometimes it's not all okay. And sometimes hard decisions have to be made about risk people take in the pursuit of whatever it is we are pursuing. So I think that's something we have to get comfortable with. And that's where organizations like IIRSM and us sharing our experience and learning more about risk management is really, really important. I think it allows people to engage with discomfort. So if you are in an environment where you feel you are able to tell the truth and you trust people, you can go into that place of discomfort where you do say, maybe this isn't a good idea, or this is what I'm worried could happen because of this, or this is a big risk we're taking here. This is the potential worst case scenario. And do you know what, that could happen? Are we comfortable with it? Trust allows people to ask questions. If you're in an environment where you trust people, you will ask those questions. If you trust the person who is your key business stakeholder, they can ask you questions. You can ask those difficult questions that maybe you wouldn't ask if you didn't trust people. I think one of the other quotes that I've toyed with putting at the top of this is the speaking truth to power. I think this is what this is, or this enables this as well. If you trust those people you're talking to, you have a sense that you're able to speak truth to power. And actually, that's so important in risk-based roles, is that you are there and able to say these things, again, using the right language, because things get lost if you use the wrong language. I think trust allows us to learn when things don't go to plan. So we all have many, many learning opportunities. Every organisation does, and in safety we talk about near misses, but it's the same in any other risk domain. There are lots of times things go okay, but you could have learned something from them. And when you trust the people in the organisation, you trust the people you work with, you're much more likely to have that conversation and that learning from, okay, well, this didn't quite go as we hoped. What did we learn from it? What would we do differently next time? And it kind of allows you to be vulnerable. And I think the final point, and people to flag risk that there might be a blind spot to. There's a lot of risk in organisations that maybe people don't notice, they don't identify. And if you look in the broader risk domains, sometimes that's because people have worked somewhere for a long time, they're a bit institutionalised, or maybe a whole sector of companies do things in a certain way that's always the way it's been done, and it's an acceptable risk, if you like, in that space. And people go, well, it's what everybody does. And actually someone who comes in new might have a different lens on that. But unless they're in that place where they feel they've got trust, they perhaps don't know who to tell, or just don't feel comfortable, and they were that moment that you could have gone, actually, we had a blind spot, we didn't even see that. So I think that's really, really important here too. I wanted to flag on this slide the difference between trust and psychological safety, because psychological safety I am fascinated by. I think it's really, really interesting. I would highly recommend reading Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organisation. It's more than just trust. So psychological safety is about a team dynamic. Trust is individual. I've picked up trust as the first one. I think you build from that to this psychologically safe workplace. That's the next big piece. But I think you've got to start with this basis of trust, where as a risk expert, you know that you're going into a meeting able to tell the truth, not tell people what they want to hear, flag stuff that concerns you in a way that has the right impact. So it's not giving people the answer, it's making people understand what you're seeing. And the next slide, please, is curiosity. I love a bit of curiosity. I've read, as I got more interested in risk and more interested in, if you like, my interest in risk came along the same time as I got more interested in the different ways and views of looking at safety. So be that safety differently, new view, HOP, whatever it is, I just wanted to learn more about different things we might be thinking of in a safety space. And as I read more, you kind of read a document or a paper and it links you to another one. And these are a few quotes and things that I've really started to consider in terms of actually, are we curious enough? And are our systems curious enough and set up to be curious? Humble Inquiry is another book that I would absolutely recommend. And it's a short one, that one, so you can get through it quite fast. But it really made me think about the questions we ask and the way that we ask them. So when you're talking about risk and understanding risk and thinking about it, Humble Inquiry, the questions that you do not asking, the questions you do not know the answer to, of building relationships built based on curiosity and interest in another person. How much of risk previously, like be it safety or anything, has been about compliance and checklists? And actually how much of it has been about having really good conversations that mean we're interested in people and actually understanding their perspective. Seek first to understand, then be understood. How much understanding do we build up through our curiosity? Or how much do we want to go out and check things are being done the way we have prescribed they should be done? I love the Donald Rumsfeld quote. And I know when I first heard it very many years ago, I was like, what? And the more I've thought about it in a risk space, the more I've understood it. And certainly through COVID, you could see moving through these kind of known knowns, unknown knowns, unknown unknowns, those spaces we moved through. It's quite interesting. And I think those unknown unknowns, those things that are coming at us that we don't know what they could be. Okay, we maybe got some of them, but there are unknown knowns. There's stuff that we know is out there, but we haven't perhaps planned for properly, or we need to be thinking about how do we understand that. I use the quote work as imagined versus work as done so often, because it's something that pulls me back to my role in organisations and really understanding what's happening. And that, again, it's not just about safety. If you look to, I think the things that have happened in the financial institutions have been really interesting to look at as a risk professional, and actually how kind of the work is imagined, what people were doing versus what compliance teams thought was going on, the risks that were actually being taken versus the risk that if you had you were auditing and assuring you thought were going on are very, very different. And finally, Todd Conklin, again, another person that the books I find fascinating. We can only understand the event by discussing what actually happened. Organisations usually tend to ask questions in order to confirm what they believe they already know. All it takes is humility and curiosity about how your organisation functions. Workers do what they do for a reason, and the reason makes sense to the worker given the context. I challenge myself with that every time you go, why did that happen? Why did someone make that choice? Because it made sense to them. And so again, risk leadership is about being curious, understanding all these traits make for good risk leadership. And the next slide down is just pulling these out into a risk management framework. So I could have talked about risk management frameworks. I could have talked to you about identification, measurement and assessment, mitigation, reporting and monitoring, and governance, and they're all part of a risk management framework. You can pull many, many diagrams of risk management frameworks. You can see HSG 65, so the UK health and safety guidance in here. You can see the ISOs in here. Fundamentally, it's the same cycle of things that we're looking at. But if you don't have these underpinning ownership, language, trust, curiosity, then it's just a system that doesn't really function very well, and it maybe ticks a box, but is it actually doing what people want it to do? And is it really changing the culture and the climate of the organisation to think about risk and engage with risk in a different way? And I would challenge that it's not, unless you start to build these things into it. And all these bits that we will do and we will touch every day as people who work in a risk profession, I would challenge us all to think about these 4 things and how they come to our work every day, and if they really do, or if we feel like we're kind of paying them enough attention, because they're the things that are going to really shift the climate and the culture. It's probably not a form that we've designed. That's the end of my slides, I think. And what I wanted to do was have some time for some questions, because I think that's the most interesting bit around this, and actually talk more as a group and learn together, because this is obviously my perspective. So be really happy to answer any questions or have a conversation with anyone who's on the broader group about what these show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. I don't have any questions for the moment. Alison, do you have any questions for Ruth?
Well, I do, and I must say, I haven't used GoToWebinar before, and I've struggled with it. It hasn't let me do any chat or any questions. So I hope that there's not people sitting there who are also trying to write questions into you, because it was a really fascinating discussion. I'm really glad we had you as our launch presentation, but it would be disappointing if we couldn't get that sort of group discussion at the end. But I certainly have a question. Okay, I love your idea about using the right language to communicate with people, and getting away from checklists and making it more a conversation. But with risk management, with such a legal field that we work in also, I wanted to ask you about documentation and evidence collecting, because I love your ideas, but I was wondering where your balance on that fits, please.
I think it's a really good question, because I think we don't challenge it enough. So I think we have kind of perceived expectation of certain amounts of documentation that are needed. And yes, we do need some, but actually if we really challenge ourselves to the value of everything we're writing down, I think that there is more perceived value than actual value. And so I did a piece of work where I went to speak to the HSE in the UK, and I spoke to our insurers, and I've spoken to lawyers to say, okay, what bits of this are really valuable and what bits of this do we perceive are valuable? And actually some of what is produced in the name of risk management is sometimes actually it over-assures people, if you like. So we've got many, many checklists, but actually, is that really indicative of what's happening on the ground? And when something does go wrong, do they help or do they hinder? And so although I believe that stuff needs to be documented, I believe as risk professionals, we need to ask the question about why we're doing that, and do we really know what we're doing that in pursuit of? Because I think sometimes it's just because it's the way it's been done, or it's what we've kind of inherited, or it's a system we've put in, and we've got that perception that that's what's important. But actually, when you really dig into it and you really dig into the value, you end up going down this really weird Alice in Wonderland place where you go, actually, I'm not quite sure why we're doing this in the first place. And you get to what's the really important stuff, because there is the important stuff. It's just that it feels like there's quite a lot of distraction, if you like, within getting to that point. Does that make sense?
I completely agree with you. I like the idea of an ideal world where we're trying to make a better world of work and keep people safe. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with someone who's very experienced in this area, and it was about making safety observations and getting large numbers of them from across his very large organization. And he told me that he was worried as soon as someone has an accident, and this was in the UK, so this isn't Switzerland, and perhaps it's very different here. So someone has an accident, the insurance company comes in, they're looking for evidence of foreseeability. They can go to his observations checklist, which will be large, and it will be very easy, probably, for them to find several similar events that might not have been closed out as well as he would hope. And he was very concerned that he was actually giving the lawyers something to hang him with at a high corporate level. So this isn't sort of operational. We're trying to make it better for everyone as a world of work, but for his what he was going to go and say to his chief executive about this.
And that's a really interesting one, because I think that's all about how we frame the tools and the processes that we put in place. So that if you have a system by which 100 people in 10 days have identified the same problem and you don't do anything about that, and that causes a critical failure like 5 days afterwards, you've got to ask if your system's working properly. If it's one thing comes up because it's one of the remote things that might come up and it's 3 reports out of 500, then actually would that be significant or insignificant, not as significant enough? So I think it's all about how you frame these, and talking to pragmatic lawyers over here, if you get the right advice, you can frame these tools in a way that they don't cause you problems in the long run, because actually you are trying to do something positive. And there is a place where you go, actually we have to look at kind of what risks are identified, like what makes something significant. If it comes up hundreds of times, it is significant. But if we're doing observations, there are some things that we have to accept. People aren't going to close out within a week because they see them as insignificant. So I think part of that is, and that's the really interesting bit about being in risk and safety, is how do we make these tools work for both the positive and also to protect the organisation we're within, without them becoming a bureaucracy that doesn't actually have any impact.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And you know, to have that idea of exploration, and what did you say? You said creativity, rather than putting your head in the sand and thinking that everything's perfect. That's completely on my way, but thank you very much. So I've asked a couple of questions. I still can't see any questions in the chat, but I'm really thinking that
I've got
maybe
the questions, Alison. We're in a separate section. So this is quite a long question. So this is from Simon, so bear with me. I hope I do it justice. When you have no accurate data to start with, how can you move from qualitative risk assessment to quantitative risk assessment, especially when one can't base it on others' records due to the impact of the individual and corporate risk attitudes and tolerances? Sorry, I didn't read, I got a bit muddled in the middle. Did you get the gist of that?
I think sort of, and if I didn't, Simon, I apologise, flag it. Or I think I suppose it's how much value you put in what you have today, because you can inherit a lot of risk assessment documentation that actually doesn't reflect at all what's happening on the ground. So I suppose my view would be you really need to understand the problem you're trying to solve, and maybe risk assessments that you inherit help that, or maybe going out and talking to people helps that, or maybe understanding your industry better. But I think sometimes we try and solve the paperwork rather than trying to understand the problem more. And the first thing we should be asking ourselves is, do we actually understand the problem we're trying to solve here, or the problem we're trying to support here? That's kind of, so whether quantitative, qualitative, whatever you want to talk about, I think a lot of this should be about, do I know what I'm trying to solve? Do I know what the significant risks are within my area or within the activities that we're doing? And have I spent time understanding what's actually happening? Because as you look at the work as done versus work as imagined piece, you really kind of start to unpick that, don't you? And you go, okay, hang on a minute, this is what we believe is happening, but actually what is happening is very different often. I hope
Great,
that helps. It doesn't.
Yes, sorry, my reading of the question didn't help. So we've got another one from Vanny. COVID-19 has exposed the extensive need for psychological risk to be prioritised. In your experience, is psychological risk being given the same level of priority as is physical risk factors, as physical risk factors are? If not, what needs to happen?
I think it depends what sector and what area you're working in. So I think it is in some areas, I think it might not be in others. I think there is a challenge at the moment around kind of the psychological risk and psychological safety, because they are two very different things. And psychological safety is this group trust construct, and the psychological risk, which I believe is what Vanny's getting to, is the actual the impacts of work on people's psychological health. And are we thinking about that when we're planning for health and safety risk management? I think it's got a way to go, in the same way that physical safety had a long way to go. I also think as professionals we need to kind of build our understanding about how we make that part of the risk management framework that we bring in, and how it becomes something, you know, I talked about language and making sure the language makes sense and it can be cross-domain. I think it's really important that we don't end up with a new language for the psychological impacts on health to add on to the physical safety risks on health, to add on to all the other risks, because at the end of the day, it is a risk we're managing. I also think culturally, it depends on what country you're in. So, you know, when you work in a global organization, people's focus will be different. And I think we have to learn to kind of build systems that understand that and do take into account the kind of the psychological impact of work, but equally kind of how you get safety is different in different countries, and that kind of how we make sure that we're talking about them in the same way. So I think it's a space where people need to grow, but we need to grow in a pragmatic way that makes it another risk that we're trying to manage for people.
Thank you, Ruth. And talking of culture, we've got a question here from Imran. Very informative stuff, but don't you think that along with leadership, we need to pay more attention to the culture, as well as most of the other stuff becoming a tick box exercise?
I think, yes, the culture is so important. I think culture is everything, but I think all those things need to, so when you get to the point of what is the culture, the leadership will kind of set the tone, if you like, of that culture, because if they don't live and breathe it, and the way you lead doesn't live and breathe it, then nobody will believe it's got any integrity. We all know that, and we've all seen that play out before. So yes, the culture is really important. Getting these tenets right, these kind of the behaviors that express the culture, is really, really important. And then making sure there is deep, deep integrity within it. And I'm a strong believer in, you have an overall culture, risk is part of that, because all of these things relate to other parts of the organization, and safety is part of that too. But you're right, culture is so, so important. And it's something that, you know, that saying culture eats strategy for breakfast, it's so true. The culture of an organization is absolutely critical to the success of any of these, but leaders do set that tone. And I think that's kind of so important, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get to that in these slides, was you can have all the statements about culture, but if leadership aren't living and breathing it, then it doesn't mean, people see through that so fast. Great, thank you. Now this is a long one. This is from Tony, but it's some observations finished off with a question. Great presentation, Ruth, and thank you, IIRSM Europe. Unfortunately, I feel there is a drive to document all the nitty-gritty points, which does make it difficult and time-consuming to complete documents. Language on documents is also an area that has been mentioned that quotes to set legislation should be recorded. Do you feel that the industry is managing to ensure that this is a little less onerous? Do I feel? I think it depends where you're looking at. I think we are all charged with that. I think it's very important. I think it has gone down a very odd route around kind of the documents and more documents, and you get to the end of a 100-page risk assessment and you never remember what you read on page 1. So I think we're all charged with that and questioning it. It's not easy, but I think if we are all asking, and kind of that curiosity piece, that what are we trying to do with this? What do we think this is going to help us as an organisation do, because I think that's really interesting when you start to kind of get those to the bottom of what the perceived benefits are of all this paperwork, and you start to ask people about what they think the benefits are. Sometimes you realise that those benefits aren't actually there, or that you kind of networks of people and groups of people can get together and challenge them. And that's where groups like this are amazing, because we can have a conversation and people go, well, I kind of talked to this person about that and found out the blue tape challenge the HSE were doing about 5 years ago was really interesting, because that was like kind of a lot of this, people think insurers need it, but insurers don't need it. So who does need it? And you kind of go around in this circle where you realise everybody's doing it for somebody else they think needs it, but nobody's actually said they need it, and you end up kind of being a bit cyclical. So I think we're all charged with that. I do think it's difficult, and I think you get some push from different places, but it's really important to dig into why people are pushing for that and what perceived benefit there is.
Thank you, Ruth. And then just one last question, which is a short question from Eric. How do you reduce the level of risk at the workplace without leadership commitment from the top? That's an interesting one.
I think this is a bit about risk ownership. So I think it depends what you talk about commitment from the top, because commitment from the top can be very broad reaching. And if you're in a large organization, it's actually, I think there's this place where you have the people who really understand and make those decisions about what the day-to-day activity looks like on an operational site, if you like, or within an operation. And they're kind of often in the middle somewhere. And actually they've got a real role in owning risk. And yes, I agree. Anyway, like leading is really, really important. But actually, there's that group. And if you spend a bit of time thinking about who are those people who really make those critical decisions and accept risk and tolerate risk, then you can start to think more about actually who do I need to engage with. And sometimes you engage with them and then you kind of push things up. And sometimes the leadership make a big commitment. But I think it's important to think about kind of who really has that direct influence, rather than who's, I suppose, sometimes the flag bearer for a change. And you work, you know, we all work in different organizations, and there will be different levers you pull dependent on maybe a business area as well. It might be a business area, it might be a group of stakeholders, it might be there's an opportunity somewhere because someone's particularly interested and you can try something out. And I think we're charged with that, to start to think about how we can make that change. If maybe we need to get the language and understanding better before the leadership really commit, how do we do that? So that would be something that I think is really interesting to us. But I do agree, obviously, leadership commitment to kind of managing and understanding risk is pretty important, to say the least, if you're going to have an impact.
Thank you, Ruth. That was the last question. Number of comments saying great presentation, thank you, enjoyed the presentation. So I'll invite Alison and the committee to come back on. And if anybody
Sorry, Julie, John had a question as well that came up on the chat, so maybe John can ask his question.
Okay, so I'll put the camera on, so I thought we were coming back in as well.
Hello, John.
Hi, Ruth, thank you very much for that really good presentation. Just reflecting on your commitment to psychological safety and how fascinating you find it in culture, and also the leadership aspect of that. I know I've spoken to a lot of leaders who will say on topics like, well, we don't have a problem. If we did, my team would talk to me about it and I would know about it. And they really believe they have this psychological safety, and they don't. And it's often quite complex, as you say. It's often about the organisation culture, not necessarily directly about their leadership. But do you have some advice on where people should start if they really want to understand it, if it is safe, and how to make a difference?
Do you know, I think it's one of the things I was thinking about a lot, where what can we bring to this conversation? So like everybody's talking about it, what can we bring? And if you look at the kind of the curious questions you can ask, so when we have that opportunity to really understand what's going on under the skin of part of our organisation, do we take that and do we ask open, curious questions where we understand, where people feel like you kind of go, okay, so kind of, what is there anything that surprised you about the work that we do here? Is there anything that kind of you've thought about raising, but you don't know where you would? Kind of those kind of questions that you have a real conversation, you dig in. And I was talking to someone earlier about 12 years ago when we would have gone out with a risk assessment and said, is everybody doing what they said they'd do in the risk assessment actions? And going, yep, they're doing everything brilliant. Actually, maybe moving away from that and having those conversations that then you get under the skin of it. And what happens then in experiences, you find out the stuff that leadership go, how did I not know that? And they go, well, because people don't know where to go, they don't feel the right space, and this is what psychological safety is about. So in a way, what you're doing is you're being a magnet for that kind of information that then goes, hang on, and they should know that, and they don't. And I think that's the more I've looked at the way we use questions and the way we identify risk, the more I've thought about actually we've got a real place to support with that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I know because you mentioned the work as imagined versus work as done, and we're doing a lot of work on drift as well in the organisation. And if you ask one of your employees, do you always follow the procedure? They'll probably say, well, of course I do. But if you can ask the question in a different way and you look for examples of drift or something like that, then you get better answers. Yeah, so I think you have to be really good with the questions.
Absolutely. So things like what makes your life at work difficult, what makes a job difficult to do is much better than do you follow the procedure, because you're going to say yes, I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. I think one of the things we haven't talked much about is, so you've introduced culture of an organisation, and we're Europe, and you're sitting in the UK, and I come from the UK. It's one of the things I found most fascinating coming to Switzerland and, you know, having experience in other places throughout, particularly Europe, but maybe a bit in the US as well, how different we work. I mean, we've talked today about paperwork and you know, trying to get it in hearts and minds rather than that as an approach. I think this is something that happens quite well in Switzerland. They're very much more into personal responsibility than in the UK. And it's really fascinating to compare the two. Maybe we'll have a webinar on that sometime in the future. The difference in approaches, because it really is hugely different. And there's pros and cons with both. So it doesn't always work well here. And I know it doesn't always work well in the UK as well.
I think that would be fascinating. I love a good book, clearly. The Culture Map. I don't know if anyone's ever read that. I found that as such an interesting book to read in terms of thinking about doing global roles or roles across different countries and how you approach and kind of getting back to fundamental principles rather than compliance to local regulation, because that's where you have to get back to, don't you? So I'd be so interested to understand more.
Yes, yeah. I have now a list of books to read, so I have my weekend planned. Thank you for that too.
No problem.
Does anyone want to add anything more, or should we bring it to a close? Philip, do you want to say final last word?
Yes, I'd just really like to say this is a really great start. I've loved listening to. I could listen to Ruth talk all day long anyway, so that's always a good one for me. But I just hope this gives everybody a glimpse of what we're trying to do in Europe, but also across the globe anyway. And I'm excited. I see a real benefit of you all coming together and working with us going forward, and I'm excited for this group especially, and I thank you all for your volunteer, because it's you know, you've all got day jobs to do, so it's really very much appreciated. So thank you so much, and I hope everything goes well. If you need anything, just call out to us and we'll be there for you. Okay, thanks a lot.
We will do. Can I lastly say thank you to Julie, who's the one person who hasn't appeared on the screen, and she's been an enormous help. So thank you to her as well, and to everyone for coming and joining us at this start of our new adventure. So thank you.
So thank you everyone for presenting. Thank you everyone for attending. The recording will be uploaded onto the IIRSM YouTube channel, hopefully today, but it might be tomorrow. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks for it.
Has it stopped? Does everyone disappear?
Looks like there's still 32 people on board.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. I found your presentation thought-provoking and really dynamic. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah.
No problem at all. It was nice to kind of think about something other than COVID for a bit and go, oh yeah, this is what we used to do.
Yeah.
It was really clear as well, because it's such a big topic that can go anywhere, and you kind of had a simple path through it, which